Meshack Masibo, and welcome to the Data Protectors podcast. Today we are on episode 8, which is the final episode in this thrilling and exciting series of episodes, of podcast episodes. Today we'll be taking a different route for our podcast. We'll be hosting, a different person will be hosting the podcast, and her name is Mercy Kingori, and I'll invite her to take up the hosting from then on, and then she can guide us on the way forward.
General conversations. This week, we will have a conversation tailored to small civil society organizations. Particularly, our focus will be on how civil society organizations can boost compliance with the Act in their various communities. Particularly, we'll be looking at what are some of the ways that they can contribute and what are some of these concrete examples that we're observing in the region. But before we go into this exciting episode, let's have a look at the partners behind this podcast. Have you heard of the African Union, European Union Digital for Development, or D4D Hub? In a nutshell, it's a project that aims to increase cooperation in the digital field between Africa and Europe, and it is implemented by 8 organizations including GIZ, the German Development Agency, and KICTANet. Did you know our Data Protection Act in Kenya was inspired by the European one, the GDPR? Therefore, data protection is an exciting and promising field for Africa and Europe to collaborate on. And this is how this podcast came to life. We will share more information about the AU-EU D4D Hub project and the partners as we go along. But let's start hearing from our guests. For this episode, I'm excited to be joined by Meshack Masibo from Kenya and Elliot Bendinelli. They'll serve as our guides for these episodes.
Okay, I think I can start with my introduction and then Elliot can go. So my name is Meshack Masibo. I wear many hats. I am a lawyer and data protection, both specialist and, do I say aficionado, but the hat that I'm here under is a data privacy lead at KICTANet, which is a Kenya ICT Action Network.
Over to you, Elliot. Please introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you for having me. I'm Elliot Bendinelli. I'm Program Director at Privacy International, and I'm a technologist by trade. And my work is focused mostly on challenging corporate exploitation of data through research, advocacy, and legal action.
Thank you. Before we go ahead, I think it would also be good for me to introduce myself. So, as I mentioned, my name is Mercy Kingori. I work as a policy analyst for Africa at the Future of Privacy Forum. So FPF is a non-profit think tank that focuses on consumer privacy, helping policymakers, privacy professionals, academics, advocates to find consensus around responsible practices for emerging technologies. So we can delve into the podcast. Thank you for the introduction. Then I'll start with you, Meshack. What are the 3 key roles that you think civil society plays in promoting the right to privacy?
Okay, that is a very interesting question, and I think I'll just talk about the work KICTANet does, I think from that context. So a lot of the work we do is under 3 pillars. So there is the aspect of creating awareness, which also is part of why we're on this podcast and all of the different things. So we create awareness on the right to privacy into the general demographic and to people. That's one aspect. Also, there's another aspect of training. So you also build the capacity of different people in terms of data protection and the right to privacy. And then also the third one is advocacy. So advocacy involves now advocating and actually fighting for privacy in different ways. So I think a practical example of this is when there was a Huduma number bill. So you are part of a coalition of civil society organizations that made a petition to Parliament, specifically went to the National Assembly and made our submissions on how the Huduma number bill wasn't complying with the Data Protection Act and with the right to privacy, and how it will be or can be amended to be able to align it with the privacy, with the right to privacy and all of those sections. So ideally, those are the 3 core ways under which we work we promote the right to privacy, and that's the different areas. I think I'll share more as we go along here.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Meshack. To Elliot, could you also kindly give us, from a European perspective and also based on your experience, how are civil societies in Europe helping to boost compliance with the national data protection laws in their different societies?
Sure. I think there are quite a few different ways. The first one, and I think is the one I'm most familiar with, is basically to investigate and expose abuses. So since the GDPR entered into force in 2018, kind of our approach as Privacy International, but our organization that followed the same way, was to find actors that we believe have practices that are unlawful under GDPR and try to investigate those practices and expose them. So that can be either through desk research or technical research or any type of investigation, really. And so usually by doing this research, we can create some form of engagement with these companies, going to them directly, seeing if they're willing to fix the problems. And if that doesn't produce any positive output, then we can just submit a complaint to the regulators and try and get the regulators to impose changes on this company. So that's kind of like one first way of acting. You want to boost compliance, you just get the companies to change their behavior or get the regulators to focus their attention on those companies. A second interesting angle, I think, is about educating and informing the public about their rights and how they can act. So I think, especially like in Europe when GDPR came into force, there was a lot of different discussions on how people would be impacted. A lot of discussions focused mostly on the impact on companies, but there is an interest in trying to explain to people what the impact is for them and what kind of rights they have access to, what kind of things companies or corporate sector do that is unlawful and that they should try and contest or avoid. So that's the second way. And finally, the last point I would suggest is to work hand in hand with regulators when possible. So either, to provide, for example, guidances to companies or work with them on investigations, but try and keep a good relationship with regulators who are trying to enforce the data protection law.
Thank you for that. I think those three main roles that you are playing in helping civil society, or rather in civil society, to promote data protection are crucial. If I may ask, are there any efforts that you could maybe explain to us that have led to changes that you have observed from your work?
Sure. I think going back to the investigation and exposing abuses, we have two very interesting cases. The first one is in 2018, we had basically our eyes on an entire industry which we thought was problematic, which is the ad tech and data broker industry. So for those not familiar with that, the ad tech industry is basically the industry in charge of tracking your eyeballs online, tracking everything you're doing on website and apps so that they can profile you and serve you with ads. And they usually work very closely with data brokers whose whole purpose is to build these profiles, collect as much data as they can on individuals so that they can be used for other purposes. And so when the GDPR came into force, we thought that this industry was clearly in violation of a number of points of this legislation. So we conducted some research, mostly desk research. We used our rights. So we sent a lot of data subject access requests to get information about us to those companies or companies in this sector. And we ended up with a number of complaints against 7 companies that we submitted in different jurisdictions, so in France, the UK, and Germany. And that took a long time, but that basically put the attention of these regulators on this industry. And that was 5 years ago. And only about a month ago did we finally get a response, or not a response, but the end of one of these investigations in France against Criteo, which is a massive ad tech company. It's one of the unicorn, a really big French company. And they were fined 40 million euros, which is close to the maximum fine you can get under GDPR. So that was one example of, we knew this industry was problematic. We did the research. We worked hand in hand with the regulator, and that the output was that this company got fined. So they're appealing. It's not the end of the story, unfortunately. But the idea here is to send a big signal to the entire industry saying you have to review what you're doing, because right now it is under GDPR. And a very similar example case we had at a smaller scale was looking at publishers. And we were looking at websites who basically share health-related data, so very sensitive data, in particular related to depression. And in this case, we pushed the investigation slightly further in the sense that we did tech research to analyze and really expose how, when you were going on these websites and responding to a depression quiz, for example, your answers were being shared with a third-party company without any information, without any sort of consent, and that's clearly in breach of the GDPR. And again, we took this as a complaint. First, we took it with the company, never got any response. So we submitted a complaint against the company to the CNIL in France, the regulator. And recently they came up with a decision and they fined this company about 800,000 euro, I believe. So again, it's both about having concrete results against these companies and forcing them to change their practices, but it's also about sending a signal to the rest of the industry that it's not business as usual anymore. You have to adapt, you have to change. This is the new legal setup, and those practices are not acceptable.
Thank you for that comprehensive breakdown on the impact that your work has had on industry. So I think just still on you, Elliot, and I think I'll also forward the same question to you, Meshack. What are the main challenges that civil society faces in advancing the right to privacy, and what are some strategies that you think can be used to overcome these challenges? I'll start with you, Elliot.
Sure. I think one of the big challenge civil society have, and we've encountered many times, is the opacity of certain industries and actors. If you're looking in particular at big tech companies that have a lot of power, that are doing a lot of things, it can be really hard to get a sense of how they're technically doing things, what they're doing exactly. There's still, for example, a big belief that your phone is listening to you, when actually the tech in the apps or the website doesn't even need to be listening to you to be able to profile you or understand what you're doing. It just has to look at your location, activity, time, other people you're nearby. There's a lot of other signals that can be used. So this opacity it can be really tricky to be able to demonstrate basically that a sector or a company is doing something that's unlawful. Or it can be, I'd say that's one of the main challenges. Another challenge that we encountered in Europe is the limited resources of regulators. So, like you could guess from what I was when I was describing the case with Criteo, some of the investigations and the complaints have taken years just to produce an outcome, and that's because regulators only have limited time and resources, and they can only focus on certain number of actors. And so that can be problematic because it means that some industries will just use that to their benefits and take advantage of that and think we can just continue doing whatever we're doing. The regulators don't have time to look into into our activities. And one last point, if I may, is I think just sorry to continue at this point, it basically leads to a lack of enforcement, which is the big issue right now. Some things we think are unlawful, very problematic and privacy invasive, haven't been dealt with just because of the lack of resources or the lack of enforcement due to lobbying. And the last point I wanted to build on is that some industry at their heart are relying on privacy invasive business practices. So it's the unlawful exploitation of data is what defines their business and how they make money. And that's kind of the case for the ad tech industry, the data broker industry, and some big tech companies. And so by trying to challenge that, we're challenging their very existence and business model, which means that they're not willing to try and change because there is no change that really exists for them. So it's just about defending their business as long as possible and try to, make it profitable as long as possible. Which means it's a really tough fight. It's not just trying to change some behavior. It's about eliminating actors entirely.
Thank you for that. Meshack?
Yeah, I think my answer will really mirror a lot of what Elliot is already sharing. I think we face similar challenges. Maybe the unique one I'd say is challenges trying to get the different bodies to listen to the views of civil society. So I'd say also, I'd just speak on the work that we did on the Huduma Namba, I think with other civil society organizations like Article 19 and Nubian Rights Forum. So the idea that you would go to parliaments, to a public participation forum, you'd make your submissions and say, okay, we need, for instance, a data protection impact assessment done. We need to know a bit more about who has access to this data and all that. But you go to the next round of, again, public participation and your views were not incorporated. And ideally, you've done research and shared the data and all that. So I think that becomes a challenge in the sense that, yes, you advocate, yes, you say that we need laws to align with this certain constitutional provision, or you need laws to align to certain things, but it's not incorporated in the final bill. So I think that aspect and that unwillingness, I think, on the side of government at certain points to be able to listen to non-state actors like civil society, that's one bit. I think also the second on which also a bit, I think mirrors a bit what Elliot said, is the whole concept of now resources. So the idea that initially, I think now the situation is a bit better, you'd have challenges to, when you're, let's say, trying to reach out to the ODPC, over who's the data commissioner, over any particular rights violation that you perceive, or maybe it's if you have an issue with digital lending companies or any particular person. So the time that you would take between making the complaint and getting feedback will be several months until you and the complainant is actually tired. So I think that also mirrors a lot of what I've heard locally from other civil society as well, and just the idea that they were a bit resource staffed at a particular point, and also they didn't have enough staff. So I think that has changed as time has gone by, and they've hired more people, and I believe they're more responsive. But I think that point, that the lack of resources and lack of personnel and that lack of feedback when you're making a complaint is another thing that we faced. And I think the third one, which is just the same one ties in with the general idea of what you're doing, is awareness. So most people don't understand the whole concept of the right to privacy. So sometimes it feels like you are shooting yourself in the foot because people, like, for example, let's take the whole WorldCoin situation. You can be on the one end of the earth shouting, okay, this is your data, protect it. But for another segment of the population, they feel they can easily trade it with so long as they get something from it without really any consideration to the consequences of that. So ideally, it's, from what we see, there are those three core challenges: the lack of awareness, which makes it harder to make people understand that this is private, this can lead to a number of consequences; the lack of government to take into consideration some of the views of civil society and non-state actors, and there are also limited resources on the side of the government, and also sometimes even from civil society, also resources to be able to perhaps take some of your actions to the grassroots and to just move the conversation from conference rooms in Nairobi to places where people actually need it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Meshack. I think you almost preempted my next question on what tools can civil society organizations use to strengthen their roles. One of them that you mentioned is, taking the conversations away from the office spaces and to the people. So, and I think that's very, very important. And the ODPC in Kenya has been very active on that front, even with the recent opening of their regional offices. Elliot, I don't know, are there any tools that you think civil society, from your experience in the civil society space, can use to strengthen their roles that we earlier mentioned, in the advocacy work or any other work that they engage in to promote data protection?
Yeah, I think this last point is really important. I really appreciate Meshack raising that, the awareness and the education. So I think to a certain extent, any kind of educational work that civil society can do to try and share the knowledge and make people more aware of their rights. And in that regard, I think that some interesting tools can be, data rights templates. So we've done this at Privacy International, where we have templates for data subject access requests, data deletion requests. So, about informing people, you can do this, and here is the tool. You have a template, you just have to put your name, send it to the company where you want to get your data from. I think that's a useful tool. The second one I'd say is around more tech and investigative tools for apps and websites. So that's a bit more specific, doesn't necessarily apply to everything, but we've used that a lot in our work in the sense that those tools give us the ability to look a little bit behind the curtain. You can't get the full picture, but at least you can know if, a fintech banking app is sharing some sort of data with a third party you're not aware of, if a website is doing something slightly dodgy. And so we have a few tools like this we're trying to make available to other civil society organizations and to the general public. And broadly speaking, we're always interested in trying to see what other organizations, what kind of tools they've come up with and they've used in their investigation. Like I said, one of the challenges being the opacity of certain industries and actors. The more tools we have to look into their practices, the more ammo we have to bring them to the regulators saying, look, something really bad is happening. They're really breaching this and this articles.
Okay, I think that's a very necessary intervention, because the idea, of we're still seeing data protection as this heavy topic, but offering these templates that are easily accessible, where you only need to put in a few details, is very, very important. And maybe just to give experiences in this part of the world, in Africa, we're seeing a lot of activities also from civil society. There are a few that you could mention that we're seeing the activities. So there is SERAP in Nigeria, where they recently, the Central Bank of Nigeria changed their KYC requirements, and we saw activities from SERAP urging the Central Bank of Nigeria to, amend these KYC requirements that could potentially infringe on the privacy of Nigerian citizens. Further, in Eastern Africa, we're seeing organizations such as Unwanted Witness, who publish their annual reports on the Privacy Scorecard report, which is a tool that they use to assess and evaluate the privacy practices of organizations and companies. And generally, from our conversation, one overarching theme that keeps on recurring is as the main role of civil society is to require businesses to change their business practices. So, Meshack, from your work, how do you gauge the effectiveness of these tools? Are there any other resources or tools that you think civil societies in this part of the world could leverage to maybe cause businesses' practices to change?
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question. I think in terms of effectiveness, because ideally, if I'm just to use the maybe close to 2 years, we've been actively working on building awareness in terms of data protection and all that through social media platforms and the different means that you can use to just build awareness. We've seen that people are more aware. You'd interact with people in a particular forum and you give them at least some training. So we've also done specific trainings to targeted groups. So you do a training and the people who are supposed to, they're called catalytic training. So you train maybe 10 people who are supposed to go and train another 100 people or another group of people. And you see the effectiveness in terms of after the conference, the awareness, the level of understanding from these 10 people it's robust. So you're able to see that they actually understand a bit more. And now when you follow the catalytic program, you see that the next set of people that are actually being trained by these people are also able to understand and a bit more. And you see situations where people grow to an extent that someone says, okay, now I want to file a complaint because I took a loan with this app and they're sending me messages and they're sending me messages and sending my friends messages because I delayed to repay without the proper process. So you're seeing it in terms of it's effective, people actually learning a bit more and understanding a bit more. In terms of what can be done, I think strategies in terms of how we engage, and I think I've always held the view, which I've shared, I think, with the different actors that we met in the space, is we can leverage more on collaborating and saying, okay, instead of going and saying we have an issue with the Huduma number bill or the UPI as KICTANet, we can say, okay, we form an alliance, get KICTANet, Article 19, Future of Privacy, so a huge alliance of different organizations to be able to now to press on some of these issues. So I think we can use more collaboration like that, and I'd want to also just mention an alliance that you're a part of with KICTANet, it's called the Global South Alliance, that brings together civil society organizations from the South, the Global South. So some of them are in Brazil, some of them are in other parts of the South, Brazil, those South American countries, and some certain African countries, even Nigeria and all that. So when we have this global union, it can just be people met at a conference somewhere, but see it has a global feel. So if you are advocating, let's say, and saying, okay, as the Global South, you feel like Meta's and Facebook policies are against us, or they are not then the amount of safeguards, privacy safeguards that they offer to the global south are less than what they offer to the rest of the world, and then it's easier to advocate for some of those things as a unit. And we've done it. I remember we did a submission to the Global Digital Compact on just the whole concept of human rights and business and privacy and all that. And you see, we'd make our submissions as a Global South Alliance, so at least it has a bit more weight, and we'd say the things we want these huge big tech companies to do, the things that we feel how they're infringing on the right to privacy and all that. So I think collaboration and building and having some of those conversations and seeing, okay, how can we collaborate, how can we cross-pollinate our ideas and be able to pull together and say, okay, how do we push forward? So I've seen that in terms of making a lot of practical change and just saying, okay, beyond this being a podcast and us saying all these technical things, does it help the average person just listening to what is happening? So you see, that's what I think. Collaboration is a strategy, and working together is a strategy, and that's how, and it's effective and it's moving. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Meshack, for intervention. Yeah. So as we come to an end to our podcast, I'd like to have your final thoughts, Meshack and Elliot, on the role that civil society can have, even in the face of emerging technologies and their impact on data protection. I'd start with you, Elliot.
Yes, I think building on what Meshack just said, not underestimating the value of collaboration between CSOs is really important. At PI, what we've managed to do is submit, for example, different complaints in different jurisdictions against the same company with the help of other organizations. So each organization is submitting the complaint in their own jurisdiction, which means we have a bigger impact and we're forcing the regulators to work together. Another strategy can be, if you're focusing on a specific sector or even against a single actor within one country, to have a bigger number, like more CSOs submitting the same complaint or complaint that was very similar, just again to drag the attention of the regulator of this. So I'd say this is an important thing to keep in mind. And the other one is that data protection law is like a very important and great first step, but crucially, we need enforcement and we need key decisions. So that's why I think I've been talking so much about, working with the regulators and submitting complaints. Like a law doesn't mean much if it's not being enforced and if we're not seeing big decisions and big fines, which is it's still a real challenge. But this should be the goal we keep in mind.
Meshack.
Yeah, okay. I think also just in terms of what we need to do, it's that more collaboration, and I do the closest a bit of a shout out to some of the organizations we collaborate with. There's one called Data Privacy Brazil. I think that will be one that we do, and also Paradigm Initiative. So I think I just mentioned them in the sense that that's what we've been doing in terms of collaborating in terms of a cross-border context to advocate for some of these things. And I think what we need is more of that collaboration, more of contextualizing these conversations. If you can have these conversations in a way that people understand beyond just the Nairobi middle class or the Nairobi posh person, but someone in the village, someone who's able just to understand, okay, the person who went for WorldCoin, because ideally if you think about WorldCoin, the person who went for the average person who went for that WorldCoin craze wasn't really the type of person maybe you find in this place recording a podcast. It was the average person say, okay, who says, okay, I don't care if they take my details. If they give me 7,000 shillings, I'd like to take my chances. So I think it's more contextualizing some of these things to the people. And I'd say also maybe another avenue that you can use is even social media platforms like TikTok, the new ones, and to also connect to younger generations and say, okay, so this is what privacy means for you in the generation. As your generation, this is what privacy means for this particular context. So a bit more conversations, a bit more contextualization, a lot more collaboration, and just pulling synergies together and seeing how we're able to do it. I think also because I've hosted bits of this podcast before. Also, this is part of what we also needs to do a bit more of it, because this is it's a funded project. It's funded by particular people, but like being able to distribute this podcast to more people to be able to listen and say, okay, because there are many more interesting episodes touching on different things. So I think also this is a step ahead. Having this podcast and this many people getting to listen and to get to learn is also something that's good. It's good. It's happening and it's good and needs to continue happening. Yeah.
I do agree with you. So unfortunately, we have come to the end of our show. Thank you so much for listening. And because we have more episodes on on the Data Protectors podcast, right?
Yeah.
So you can stay updated on the data protection issues around Kenya in the AU D4D hub. And I want to thank you so much, Meshack and Elliot, for coming to this podcast episode. Just to conclude, I want to mention that the Data Protectors podcast is produced in collaboration between GIZ Kenya and KICTANet as part of the AU D4D Hub project. You can follow the AU D4D Hub on social media, and you can also find them on Twitter as the D4D Hub _AU EU. You can also contact them for questions or comments, and if you're listening to us on Anchor, you can leave a voice message. Thank you.